Today, I am here at the Carnivorous Plant Garden here in Wilmington. This is a place where if you are really fascinated with flowers that eat bugs, people drive from crazy long distances just to come here to walk through these fields. This is a field full of wildflowers, but primarily carnivorous plants that eat insects. It's pretty cool. As you walk along here, they have all of these fun facts posted. Like, for instance, did you know that the Venus flytrap is only found within a 75 to 100 mile radius of Wilmington? It's pretty cool. Nowhere else in the world can you find a Venus flytrap. So we're going to walk through this field in a moment, but before we do, I want to invite you to listen to the word of the Lord from Romans chapter 13, verses 8 through 10. Let no debt remain outstanding, except the continuing debt to love one another. For he who loves his fellow man has fulfilled the law. The commandments: do not commit adultery, do not murder, do not steal, do not covet, and whatever other commandments there may be, are summed up in this one rule: love your neighbor as yourself. Love does no harm to its neighbor. Therefore, love is the fulfillment of the law. So I am walking through the field here, and it's a little swampy, but not very buggy. Oddly enough, I wonder why that is. Now, my grandfather was a Wesleyan minister. Wesleyans are kind of our doctrinal cousins. And but back in the 50s and 60s and 70s, when he was a pastor, the Wesleyan church, both theologically and culturally, was much more rigid than the Methodist church today. And my father tells a story about when he was a kid. I'm not sure when this happened, but it was sometime in the late 50s, early 60s. My grandfather bought a TV, but he was worried that his parishioners would see him bringing the television set into the house. A television was a no-no back then, okay? And so they had to sneak it in to the home under the cover of darkness because, you know, television, all those violent and promiscuous shows in the late 50s and early 60s, shows like Leave It to Beaver and I Love Lucy. We all remember how violent she was toward those grapes when she was stomping them on the ground. Yeah, terrible show. Bad example for the kids. It's really funny to me thinking about my grandfather sneaking a TV into the house because he was ashamed and worried about what people would think. If you've been in church your whole life, you probably know by now that sometimes we just miss the point entirely. We get stuck in the weeds with silliness and things like, should someone watch a TV or not? Paul is writing from Corinth to the Romans, and he's writing to a group of people who are really in the weeds. They are stuck in the weeds. And he's trying to remind them what the point of all of this really is. The church in Rome was really small at that point. It was like 15 or 20 house churches. They were started by Jewish Christians. The first apostles were Jewish Christians. So if you were a Christian in Rome, you were likely a Jew, and that means that you kept things kosher. You adhered to the Jewish festivals and the Jewish customs. And then when they invited all of the Gentiles in, they said, okay, Gentiles, we welcome you in, but you have to be Jewish as well. So the churches were kind of like little synagogues in the homes. But then in 45 AD, Emperor Claudius expelled all of the Jews from Rome. So now all of these Jewish Christian churches became Gentile churches. And 5 years later, when Claudius died and the Jews returned, they were the founders of these churches. They returned to these churches that were now thoroughly Gentile and had no semblance of anything Jewish. And there you have your tension. A tension between the more traditionalist, Jewish, kind of old school Jewish Christians versus the more, I hate to use this word, but more progressive sort of Gentile Christians. Does that sound familiar at all? It sounds like the baseline of every argument in America, kind of the old school versus the new school, the traditionalists versus the progressives. Yeah, it sounds very familiar actually. Paul is writing to these people now, and he's trying to resolve these arguments that are so in the weeds. Let me tell you something. If Venus flytraps were that big, I wouldn't be here. Now, I haven't seen one yet. They're actually really small. So I'm on the hunt for them. I know I'll find one in a little bit here. Walking along the other side of the field here. Now, many Americans aspire to be what's called debt-free. There's this guy in the Christian church named Dave Ramsey, and he cast visions for families about what it would be like to be debt-free and how free you would feel, right? And one of the things he does is he has a radio show, and he invites these people who have been who have paid off like $250,000 of credit card debt and school loans, and they're usually like in their 30s and 40s, and they have kids, and they come in his show and they do what's called the debt-free shout. And they go in there, and after paying off all this debt, they say, "We're debt-free!" And everyone claps, and it's this huge moment. Maybe you know that feeling of writing that final check after paying off so much debt. Well, the Roman society that Paul was writing to was a society of obligation. Everyone was indebted to everybody. So if you were the emperor, everyone owed you their loyalty and allegiance. If you were a benefactor, everyone owed you money. If you were a slave, you owed your master your whole lives, your service. If you were a wife, you owed your husband submission. It was a society of obligation. And then today's passage, Paul says to us, we don't owe each other anything. As Christians, we owe each other nothing except we can never be debt-free because we owe each other love. Everyone is indebted to each other love. We always owe each other love. That is the only currency in the kingdom of God is love, and we owe that to one another. He pauses in the middle of chapter 13, and he stops, and he makes that point clear. I was in Chicago a few weeks ago on vacation, and I went to Millennium Park, and they have there a beautiful wildflower garden. It's really stunning. I mean, it looks like someone just spread wildflower seeds everywhere, and they just kind of grew up. And every morning I would kind of walk through there, and I was walking through one morning because I said, there's got to be some weeds. Like, how do they care for this? Like, I know at home, weeds just pop up all the time. And so I inspected the garden for weeds. I stuck my head in to see, where are the weeds in all of this? And I couldn't find any. And if there was any, I probably would have never seen it because there were so many wildflowers. They were just choked out. They were drowned out by all of these beautiful, beautiful flowers. It reminds me of what N.T. Wright said one time. He said, "A garden will never have weeds if you're always planting wildflowers. A garden will never have weeds if you're always planting wildflowers." He was speaking not so much literally as he was figuratively, saying to all of us, hey, many of us sit at home and we point out the weeds, or we get in the weeds with other people. We see the world through the lens of cable news, and we sit at home and we stew. We have a neighbor who offends us, and we sit at home and we just keep that anger inwardly toward them. We keep it going. Or maybe we angrily scroll through Facebook, just getting angry about people's controversial comments. And many of us spend a lot of our free time just pointing out the weeds and being angry about those weeds. N.T. Wright would say, weeds can't pop up if all you do is plant wildflowers. What is that in the kingdom of God? It's love. It's that debt of love that we owe each other. As Paul is addressing these Romans who are in the weeds, and the issue they're in the weeds about is, it sounds really silly to us today, but they were arguing about, should we eat meat that was originally sacrificed for idols? Okay. That seems a pretty silly and irrelevant argument. The Jews said you can't, the Gentiles said it doesn't matter. Paul would have absolutely sided with the Gentiles because for him, as a mature Christian, it was about the freedom that Christ gave you, freedom from the law. But Paul didn't like the way they were arguing with each other and speaking to one another. And he never said in Romans who was right. He never said if it was the Jews or the Gentiles. What he said was this: he paused in that passage I read for you today. He did this in Corinthians too on the same issue. He paused and he stopped and he gave us a call to love one another. He said, you're missing the point. All of you are missing the point. We are indebted to one another to love each other. Instead of angrily pointing out the weeds, instead of being in the weeds yourself, just plant wildflowers. And in time, those weeds will be choked out. And if they pop up, you won't even notice them because the beauty of those wildflowers will be everywhere. Plant the wildflowers. That is the love of God. Do you spend more time planting wildflowers, or do you spend more time just getting angry about all the weeds you see in the world, or all the weeds you're arguing about with other people? Paul gives us a choice today in Romans chapter 13. Will we plant wildflowers, or will we just get angry about the weeds? My friends, what a beautiful place this is, and a beautiful symbol of today's passage. I invite you to plant as many wildflowers as you can in your life.
Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost,